this computer. Okay, hi everybody. Today is March 20th, 2018. I am Aaron Kirkenberger, your moderator for today's SIG Testing weekly meeting. Today on the agenda, we've got a presentation from Adelina to talk about Windows testing, and we've got Tim Pepper from Contributor Experience SIG to give us a little bit of a roadshow that they're doing on a SIG by SIG basis. And then if we have time left over, I had a couple interesting things to talk about related to cherry picks and GitHub locals. With that said, I will hand it off to Adelina.
Thank you. I'm Adelina. I work for Cloud-Based Solutions. With me is Alessandro, whom I'm going to hand out the presentation to. And we also have Patrick and Michael from SIG Windows here. So I'm going to head the presentation to Alessandro, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth.
Yeah, thanks, Adelina. So I will just do a quick overview presentation about what we're trying to achieve here, and then I will pass it to Adelina for the rest of the conversation. So let me see how to share this thing here.
Cool. Yeah, we can see that. We see your window and a lot of tabs. That is super impressive.
Yeah. But my big complaint with Chrome is that after a given number of tabs, I cannot see anymore if there was that ad.
That's a weird zigzag background you've got on your window. Oh, those are tabs. Okay.
Okay. So, all right. So the current state. So why are we doing this to begin with? The main idea is that in the moment in which we add Windows support to a given project, especially something as complex as Kubernetes, it becomes paramount to add testing to avoid that people get regression and other issues that typically come from the fact that most of the ecosystem is not aware necessarily about the difference between Linux and Windows, so you end up very easily with a Linuxism, let's say, in the code base that will, of course, break the Windows side of things. So, of course, the obvious way to mitigate and resolve this is to add in place continuous integration testing, which is actually what we are currently doing. So, of course, since this is a project that was already very well going before starting to add the porting, it means that also most of the testing infrastructure and the tests themselves already have dependencies on Linux. So what we're doing here is to take all this work and make sure that it works in the best possible way on Windows. So the goal is, of course, is to validate bug fixes, validate new features, and catch regressions, okay? So the current status, we are currently around 67 over 149 performance tests passing and counting. Okay, so we keep on adding more and more. Objectives. So the first thing is that we're adding ACS engine support in kubetest to execute, of course, tests using Windows nodes. Working with the community, aka us here, to review and modify existing tests to pass on Windows and Linux. And eventually, the goal would be to add blocking tests for Windows in Pro. Okay, so the idea is that whenever somebody sends a PR, we will be able to catch anything that will break on Windows pretty easily before it merges and not after. Okay. Last but not least, we also want to run kubetest on on-prem clusters, having Windows nodes, and that will allow us also to test using a pretty large set of possible network plugins, starting with OVN, Planner, and more. Action plan. So, well, enable kubetest to deploy Windows and Linux VMs on Azure. So the first thing is to use Azure for that, as we already do in testing. So vendorizing ACS engine. Okay, I'm not getting too much into the details, but ACS engine is the way to go when it comes to Azure to deploy a cluster, okay? Okay, so we will need to replace container images. So we need, of course, Windows images because, of course, at the moment, at least, in the moment in which we run containers, of course, we deploy containers on Windows. Those have to be Windows containers, okay? So we need, of course, Windows images. We need the related Docker files. We need to remove hard-coded names. So here is one of the PRs that Adelina did, and I will let her, of course, go into details afterwards. And not only that, most of the containers are then used to perform actions that are Linux specific. Some of them are relatively easy to port. For example, everything that requires BusyBox, there is a BusyBox Windows porting that we're using. Other are way more complicated or cannot be ported at all. For example, if a test requires IP tables, well, of course, there is no way that we can do anything like that on Linux. Which brings me to this slide. We basically started grouping all the tests in 3 categories. One is the best possible use case, meaning that the tests are simply running as is, so without changes or with very minor modifications. The second category, it means that those tests can be ported, meaning that without too much hassle that we can take them and convert them in a way in which they can just run on Windows. The BusyBox is a perfect example here. Or cannot be ported, like requiring IP tables, as I was mentioning before. Last but not least, we also would like to add additional tests which test the specific Windows things that are not available on Linux, for example, Windows account, ACLs, and whatever else. What is completely out of scope? When we talk about Kubernetes on Windows, we talk about having Windows nodes, okay, so kubelets, kubeproxy, and so on. So we don't think about API server, controller manager, etcd, and so on. And that's pretty much it. Any questions so far?
So when you're talking about things that are excluded, you listed a bunch of things that were all control plane specific. So it sounds like you're saying like kubelet and kubeproxy would be the binaries. Okay.
Yeah, well, consider this, of course, in the moment in which we run the conformance test, we're also testing components which are not part, of course, of what is running on Windows, but are required, of course, in the moment in which we perform an end-to-end test. Does it make sense?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, I was reading through some of the PRs you linked. What are some examples of the BusyBox specific issues you're hitting?
Yeah, Adelina, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, the first BusyBox specific issue is that there's no BusyBox on Windows. I mean, the problem is that in BusyBox, the way the BusyBox image is used, from what I saw, is doing stuff like CURL or even an ls or stuff like that. That's not available on Windows. And even if it is, the output is not the same. So the test expects a specific output. It's not the same on Windows. But we did manage, talking specifically about the BusyBox image, we did manage to port it because we have all the BusyBox binaries, and we package them into a Windows container, and that works just fine. But more on a general note, talking about the images, most of them, as Alessandro said earlier, can be ported because some of them, a fair bunch of them actually, start from scratch, and you just add a Go binary in it. So that's perfectly workable on Windows, with the exception of, as I said, BusyBox, and there are a couple of 2 other images that are based on a Linux distro in particular. So that's the issue we hit with BusyBox.
So just, I apologize if I'm like being really ignorant here. So is the implication that running a node on Windows means you can't run any containers that are based on Linux distributions?
Yes.
As of today, yes. In the future, we hope to have both of them. But let's say the typical use case today is that you have a cluster with mixed Linux and Windows nodes. So basically, Linux pods and Linux containers are going, of course, to go on Linux nodes, and vice versa for the Windows ones.
Okay.
And of course, a deployment can be consisting in a mixed Linux plus Windows scenario.
Okay, so this is simultaneously making sure that you can run the binaries themselves on the host operating system is Windows, but also the containers that they run are Windows-based.
Mm-hmm.
And so the issues you're running into is when the test is trying to verify that the API or the interface provided by the kubelet is actually fulfilled. Right now, you have tests that use Linux systems to verify that that behavior happened. And so you said you're porting these images to then at runtime do a switch. So depending on which node we scheduled to check that the behavior is appropriate using a different tool, or are you building cross-platform checks? Or how does that look?
Well, as of this moment, the way we do it is we know that our cluster is having the nodes in our cluster are Windows. So basically, that's why we have a PR there. It's listed in the presentation for switching or choosing a specific registry where you can get the images. So basically, what we've done is you get all the images. They're the same name, but they are Linux specific because they're from our registries. Of course, this is just a temporary thing. They're in Docker Hub under my user, but this is temporary for testing right now. This is one option because, of course, the problem we hit now with the tests is they won't even. It's not even that they'll use Linux systems, and that's why we can test it. They don't even run because trying to pull a Linux image will not work on Windows.
Yeah, so this is Michael. So I think that it's kind of the approach here needs to be twofold. The first part is that we need to be able to detect that the host operating system is Windows versus Linux, and that's going to dictate what kind of test agents you're using, right? You know, is kubelet and kubeproxy that you're using going to be Windows-based versus Linux-based? That could also inform additional tools you need to use, whether that's BusyBox or anything else. That's part one. The second part is the tests themselves need to know what containers do I need to use in order for me to be able to execute a particular test, whether that's an acceptance test or any other type of test. And that part is what Adelina mentioned later, which is basically saying, okay, if it's a traditional test that exists in the test corpus today, then use the containers that are already defined. And if otherwise, go ahead and use containers from a different registry that are Windows-based because you're having a test case that's conforming towards Windows. So I think both of those parts need to be part of the test infrastructure that we update and build for this so that we have that flexibility. And to the earliest question that was asked, in the future, I mean, you already can today, but I envision us to add support for Linux containers on a Windows host supported by Kubernetes. And because of the Linux subsystem being available in Windows in that case, then that might make a few things easier. But I think the first part is be able to recognize that your host is Windows or Linux, use the right tools, and be able to execute the test cases, and then add the additional test cases that we're adding for Windows so that your Windows containers are the ones being executed versus Linux containers.
Yeah.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, just to clarify a point on that. Like we already have a default node label that the kubelet adds. That's beta.kubernetes.io/os. So that's already going to be set to Windows or Linux, and then of course you could use that as a node selector as needed. So,
is there does the CNCF conformance working group have commentary on this stuff, like changing the definition of what the conformance test is doing or how it's verifying that a cluster is conformant based on the OS? Like I'd expect them to have input on this as well.
we haven't talked to them yet. I mean, I think we'd be willing to do that as a next step, but given that my understanding was that since this working group sort of owns these tests, I think we want to identify what we believe is the right path forward here and then take it to them for secondary discussion.
Okay, so the highest impact next step for you would be to get in contact with Timothy St. Clair and attend. We have sort of a separate working group or subproject called the Testing Commons subproject. They're more about specifically how the tests are written and best practices there. also, Tim St. Clair is an active participant in the conformance working group and helped author Sonobuoy, which is sort of what they use as their main method of testing. But I do think like we also like have opinions. From my perspective, like this seems like kind of sane steps in the right direction. I'm having difficulty looking too far ahead to see if this turns into some like crazy fractal of permutations, but I think these are logical next steps. Like turning the image registries into flags seems pretty obvious, and finding some way to introspect the node, based on a label, and then using some kind of image maybe makes sense. But I suspect if anybody from a conformance perspective had strong opinions, Tim St. Clair would be able to provide good feedback there.
Okay. And what was the first working group you mentioned other than SIG conformance?
So the way the conformance stuff works, it's filtered across a couple things. Okay, so the Testing Commons subproject is a subproject of SIG testing, right? And they're about like, what are the best ways to write tests? How can we use reusable utilities, libraries, frameworks, things of that nature?
Okay.
So they probably have an opinion about like this, the get E2E image thing that you have scattered around a bunch of the E2E tests. Like they might have an opinion about whether there's a different approach that could be made.
Yeah.
So the group that owns like whether or not a test is considered part of conformance is the architecture SIG.
Mm-hmm.
So they have ownership over, yes, this test defines conformance. So like the architecture special interest group kind of has the most say over what Kubernetes is. And then the conformance working group is a CNCF working group, separate and apart from the Kubernetes project, that is populated by a wide variety of vendors who are all trying to find the best way to interoperate. So I apologize for making it sound like you've got to talk to 4 different groups to see if you're heading in the right direction, but I think that's kind of where we're at right now. And I personally am a huge fan of what you're doing here. These all look like the right next steps to me, so I'm happy to help out in any way that I can.
Yeah, I think the only like first blush comment that I guess I would have is talking to SIG architecture would be good, just because like as soon as the mechanism by which you validate what the test is actually trying to validate, as soon as that mechanism is changing, and that depends on which registry you're pulling the image from, that kind of moves the locus of control for that test away from the test that's actually written in the Kubernetes repo, and it moves it into whatever's implementing that image. And there might be implications of that. I can't say for sure, but like that would just be my first comment.
Okay.
So the reason I bring up the Testing Commons group is they're actually meeting tomorrow. They do a bi-weekly meeting, but if you want to get sort of this high bandwidth talking heads thing, they meet at 7:30 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow. And then they're like every other week after that.
Okay.
Good timing.
So the other question I had regarding being able to use different registries, has it been brought up in other contexts? Because I know that today it seems to have a heavy dependence on Docker Hub. And if, let's say, Docker Hub were to go down, for a brief outage, I wouldn't want all the Kubernetes tests to just fail.
Yeah, no, making the image registries configurable seems like completely non-objectionable and absolutely a step in the right direction.
Okay.
If I think about, I want to be able to have an air-gapped cluster but still verify that it is conformant. It's kind of difficult to do that today if it assumes it's going to be talking to, it's going to be able to reach GCR.io. I'm going to have to put some kind of proxy in front of it, that sort of stuff. So.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
I do have a question, though. Is there a reason not to use image manifest lists to have a OS-specific image rather than like redirecting the entire registry?
So I think it's possible for some images, but in order to be able to use an image manifest list, whoever owns that repository, and in the case of the BusyBox one, it's owned by, I guess it's Tianan or somebody that represents it in front of the community. But basically, they build those images, and it would be up to them to take ownership and maintenance of them. And so the problem is that you can't maintain. So like, let's say we found a Windows specific bug fix. we would still have to get whoever owns that original registry on Docker to update that manifest when we do a bug fix release. Whereas if we have a configurable list where we can just say, here's the known good image for this Kubernetes test, we can be guaranteed that that one could pass, and that it could do, and that it would could be mirrored in the way we just talked, as opposed to the image manifest list is always a second layer of indirection that has to go back through, the original Docker registry. So
Right.
I'd be willing to consider both options. That's just one of the pitfalls that we've had with it.
It sounds to me like perhaps we should be maintaining a set of images we use for testing ourselves with manifest lists, because the same issue could manifest for the Linux tests.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I'm getting at, because like looking at the list of images that are used today, I see things like Nginx, I see other things like that. So, if you were let's say the default Nginx image changed where instead of returning a 200, instead returns a 404 not found or something like that, because you didn't pass in any static content for it, I'd hate for that to break the tests too. So that's not really a great argument around why not to do the manifest, but I do think that having all the test collateral that's required for the conformance tests in a place that's managed by a Kubernetes working group might have other benefits. So.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you very much for showing this. This looks like pretty decent work.
I just wanted to add a little bit about the kube test part, because I know that's under test infra and maybe closer to home here.
Right.
There we started doing some work, and at this point I have a proof of concept where you can spawn ACS clusters and start the tests. My question, I guess, is how do we proceed with this? File an issue and just talk about it there, or do you have any specific ideas of how to get about this?
I'm perfectly happy having an umbrella issue saying adding ACS engine support to kube test and then PRs that tie back to that. Unless anybody else really wants a lot more structure, that works for me.
Awesome.
Okay, cool. Sorry for moving quickly here. I just want to give Tim Pepper enough time to do the Contrivex roadshow.
I can also bump to next week if you prefer.
Or
go quickly now, either way.
Let's go quickly now. Why not?
All right, so I am going to share a screen. I dropped the link a little bit earlier into the chat, and then it's also in the agenda. Let me know if y'all can see that coming through.
Yep, looks good.
Okay, so the basic idea is that we in contributor experience are trying to improve the contributor experience, kind of self-obvious plain English there. And part of that is doing some outreach, going out to the SIGs and just kind of letting them know a little bit more about what it is we're trying to do and some of the specifics and why, and where that starts to touch in other SIGs. Y'all have seen some of this already, I think, because of the specifics of where these end up interacting. So the first set of stuff on our list, some other SIGs maybe aren't quite as aware of. So I'm going to kind of just skip over that, because I think more or less everybody here is going to be familiar with that sort of stuff because it ties into existing automation. The other things that we wanted to bring up, Steering Committee has released a new set of charter templates, and just as an example, I'll pull up the one for contributor experience, but compared to the existing READMEs that are there for the SIGs, this really goes more into processes and roles and responsibilities, and just kind of talks about what it is that the SIG does and lays it out in a way that's more understandable for members, and people can see a little more clearly where they might be able to contribute and help the SIG. And again, just in support of the general idea that we're trying to build the contributor base. So there's information on that stuff that's linked in the doc, and I'll just kind of leave that at that. There is a contributor guide that we have been working on and improving. again, linked here in the document, but one of the things that we wanted to call out to individual SIGs was that where there are specifics that are different than the rest of the broader Kubernetes that read on your SIG, it makes sense to add something like a particular contributing file or a developer guide portion that's specific to your SIG that elucidates on that. And again, testing, I think, is one of the areas where there is a pretty good existing corpus of info there. So not entirely new info. Then mentoring, we have a whole bunch going on at the moment. We have a Meet Our Contributors session on Slack that's kind of, or Slack and Zoom, that's mentoring on demand. And then also at the end of the doc, there's a user office hours kind of similar, just trying to get people available for asking questions and interacting with users and contributors. There is some outreachy work that's coming over the next quarter or so that's going to be targeting new contributors. The existing group mentoring that was started in the SIG cluster lifecycle was focused on building contributors to a reviewer level. So again, sort of focusing on adding to the contributor base, but also up through the hierarchy so that we're spreading load, spreading risk, and ensuring the overall health of the project. And then we're trying to do some more buddy program sort of work where we're getting more one-on-one type of mentoring. And then we're asking that folks take a look at their Slack channel. Looking at SIG testing, I noticed there are a number of pinned documents, but some of them are fairly old, like there's a 1.9 roadmap sitting there. So these are just subtle little things that for new contributors coming along, showing up, if there's information pinned there, for example, and it's up to date, it just makes it easier for somebody new to come in and orient. And in 4 minutes, that's kind of quickly, briefly what I wanted to share with you guys. And obviously, SIG Config X channel on Slack. Come around, talk to us. We've got a lot of conversations going on around these labels and bot commands and stuff like that. And I think it's really healthy for us to be having conversations like that. So I value that testing folks are actively involved there.
Quick question for you, Tim. I noticed in the contributor guide, there's a bunch of, well, understandably, there's a bunch of talk about, okay, these are the comments you use, these are different parts of Tide, or different parts of Prow. Recently, we've been having conversations about how can we better self-host the documentation about what different components are doing and how different components can be used. And I'm wondering if you guys, I don't know, is it reasonable for us to just maybe take what you've got and then put it into a web page that Prow hosts itself? Because we've also noticed places where there are links in the current testing infra that point out to the contributor experience docs, which if you were deploying Prow, perhaps not to do Kubernetes automation, but for a different project, that link doesn't make as much sense.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's a history of kind of copy pasta and little bits of things here and there. So my vision, I think, for the contributor guide is to have less there, have it be as much Kubernetes specific as possible, and then link to existing authoritative data elsewhere where people who are subject matter experts are maintaining it. That's the most sustainable thing, I think, over time. We're working that way, I think, right now. And then also there's a KEP that Joe Breda has proposed around building up a new website that could potentially shake up some of this organization a bit more over time. But yeah, we're definitely welcome to ideas and suggestions there.
Yeah, I think we've done a pattern of linking to some manually maintained doc until such time as we've got something that's more hosted and more automatically updated. So like when there was a doc that described in great detail how pull requests were ordered in the submit queue, it's like, well, we could do that, or we could just link to that information directly in the submit queue and make sure the submit queue's merge requirements are dynamically updated based on the configuration that it's got. So more of the things that we can do, and we've made a lot of progress there with bot commands and plugins and stuff, which is one thing, but then how do you assemble a collection of plugins and do some kind of same workflow around that is a little bit meta for Prow to host at times, unless we figure out a good way to sort of represent that pattern. But I agree, the closer we can put this stuff to the thing that gets configured, the less likely it is to fall out of date. Cool.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. That's super helpful. Yeah, and for what it's worth, the other two things, I'm not going to go over them now, but I've got in that pattern of documenting things, I finally have a pull request out to document all the labels that we sync across the repos. Trying to figure out if that's got the right level of information and how we can move from a manually maintained doc to something that's self-hosted on Prow. And then in the grand effort to make a consistent experience across all repos, I want to get rid of people's need to have direct write access to repos. There are a couple things standing in the way. Garrett Rodriguez added a /milestone command a little bit back, which was one of the main things. There are a lot of labels involved with the cherry pick process that people can only manually apply right now. So there's been an experiment called a cherry picker that seems to have worked well for OpenShift, and we're moving that into a Prow plugin. Jordan Liggett made some suggestions to improve the process. That discussion happened in contributor experience, just from a what's the experience of this, but I think it would be a good idea to bring that into SIG testing discussions as we improve the cherry pick process through Prow. That's my TLDR. Anything else? All right, cool. Happy Tuesday, everybody. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.